Welcome to the concluding session of the meeting, which is on regional integration and whether it's a concept of the 21st century. We are certainly meeting at a time when integration is under challenge. We've had Brexit. We've had major trade initiatives that could have expanded integration, dying an early death with TPP and TTIP. And we've got a mood of populism and questions on globalization and its impact, which seem to be impeding this whole idea of regional integration. I'm going to make some opening remarks, and then I'm going to invite the distinguished speakers to make their comments. The essential point I'd like to make is that it really looks like global-scaled, multilateral, ambitious trade initiatives, integration initiatives are going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to pull off in the current political mood. So for smaller countries like Singapore and many of our friends in ASEAN, we are looking at alternative arrangements. And the good news is that there are many experiments going on within the region and outside that give us a sense of how we could perhaps try new initiatives that can maintain the momentum of trade openness and regional integration. One way is through small-scale efforts among like-minded nations. So the TPP was actually started as one such initiative among small, very highly open economies like Singapore, Chile, New Zealand, and Brunei. But then it morphed into something much bigger. But it is possible to extract from the TPP some agreed elements which a subset of the TPP countries could pursue, and I believe that this is actually being considered right now. Another way forward is sub-regional integration. We've got a very good example of that in the ASEAN region, in the Greater Mekong Sub-Region Initiative, which was started in 1992 with the aid of Japan and the Asian Development Bank, and which has become actually a very successful mode of regional integration. Today, there are increasing flows of goods, services, people, capital, electricity, and so on within that region. It is increasingly a success story for regional integration and something that others would want to mimic. And then you have also cross-border integration, much smaller scaled, like what you see between the northeastern part of Thailand and Laos, the southwestern part of Thailand and Myanmar in the Tawai project, and most prominently between Singapore and the southernmost tip of the Malay Peninsula in an area called Iskandar, which is very complementary to Singapore, and which both countries are seeking to merge in a certain way so that you have a single economy where both parties gain from complementariness and synergies. So we have many potential alternatives to the modes of integration that we have chosen. And we are very fortunate today to have a number of thinkers on this subject who can help us understand this issue better. Mr. Enrico Letta is here. We're making him work very hard. I don't need to introduce him again. But we're also very privileged to have Mr. Noyer, who's the honorary governor of the Banque de France and reached that position after a long career in public service. Thank you. And we have Professor Danny Quah, who's the Lee Ka-shing Professor of Economics at the Lee Kuan Yew School, and for a long time was in the London School of Economics and has contributed widely on a whole range of topics in economics. So maybe I will start with Mr. Letta, and maybe about 7 minutes on your views.
Thank you. I will pay tribute to the country that is hosting me in this very period, so I switch into French, if I can, because I think the audience is a French-speaking audience too, from what they told me. Et alors, je pars sur les je vais faire 7 minutes, 7 raisons, qui sont les 7 raisons en faveur des intégrations régionales dans le temps dans lequel on est aujourd'hui. On est dans un mood dans lequel ce n'est pas le moment le plus pushing pour les intégrations régionales. Mais je pense que il y a des raisons qui sont valables aujourd'hui comme elles étaient hier. J'en ai indiqué 7, je les dis très brièvement, mais je suis très convaincu que ces 7 raisons restent très importantes. La première raison, la coopération régionale, l'intégration régionale, c'est la façon de créer les conditions pour qu'il n'y ait plus de guerre entre les pays qui sont voisins. Je dis une chose qui est absolument simple, très simple, peut-être trop simple. On ne la répète plus, mais c'est la vérité. Et on a vu chez nous, en Europe, ce qui s'est passé entre Ukraine et Russie. On a vu ce qui s'est passé dans les pays voisins. On a vu qu'est-ce que ça veut dire et quelle est aujourd'hui la condition de dire que la coopération régionale rend impossible une guerre entre pays voisins, alors que on sait très bien que dans beaucoup de pays du monde, la question de la relation conflictuelle entre pays voisins reste un grand problème. L'Asie, et j'ajoute ASEAN, je pense aux îles naturellement de la mer chinoise méridionale, je sais très bien et je pense que ce sujet doit être répété, parce que sinon on le donne pour acquis comme bon, on a la paix. Bon, c'est pas vrai. On a la paix premièrement là où il y a des intégrations régionales qui marchent et qui créent des conditions de compréhension réciproque. Deuxième, frontières ouvertes. Ça veut dire développement des réseaux, des infrastructures, des télécommunications, de l'énergie. Les frontières fermées entre pays voisins, ça veut dire beaucoup plus de difficultés à faire tout cela. Et avoir des réseaux qui grandissent dans ces sujets, ça veut dire développement, nouvelles opportunités, capacité de croissance, parce que les réseaux sont décisifs dans le monde d'aujourd'hui et dans la globalisation qu'on est en train de vivre. Donc je pense que ce deuxième point doit être répété. Troisième point, intégration régionale, ça veut dire la construction de marchés intérieurs et ça veut dire la possibilité de faire grandir les dimensions de nos milieux industriels. Parce que c'est entre pays voisins qu'on réussit à créer les intégrations qui sont, du point de vue industriel, plus faciles. J'ajoute, je sais très bien quelle est la réaction en Europe, on en a très peu. Je dirais qu'on en a trop peu. Mais il y a des exemples qui sont des exemples de grands succès. Il est facile de citer EADS. Je citerai aussi dans le camp de l'énergie la coopération entre l'Italie et l'Espagne avec Enel Endesa et beaucoup d'autres. Mais on peut faire ça entre pays voisins parce que l'intégration aide ça. Quatrième, l'intégration régionale aide dans la gestion des crises, que ce soit les crises migratoires, que ce soit les crises environnementales, les crises liées au climate change, à tout ce qui est lié à tout ça. La coopération régionale rend possible ce qui, autrement, quand on est un pays loin ou pays dans lesquels il n'y a pas de coopération régionale, c'est impossible. Et donc, il faut le citer, là aussi, je ne veux pas dire que ce que fait l'Europe aujourd'hui est l'exemple parfait, c'est absolument pas ça, mais je sais aussi que sur ces sujets-là, quand il y a une urgence qui monte, la seule possibilité, c'est d'avoir une intégration régionale qui marche et la possibilité de mettre tout de suite en marche ces points d'application. Le cinquième, il y a des phénomènes qui impactent les politiques publiques sur le long terme, sur lesquels il faut monter de niveau pour prendre des décisions qui soient binding à un niveau inférieur. Et nous, je cite deux sujets qui sont les deux sujets les plus faciles. On vient d'en parler, et ayant M. Noyer avec moi dans ce panel, il est très facile de lui passer la parole sur ça, mais la question des dettes publiques et le fait qu'il y ait chez nous un niveau européen est une formidable ressource. Je cite toujours le cas de mon pays, sur lequel on pourrait citer beaucoup de chiffres, mais je vous en cite deux qui sont très faciles et très simples. mon pays, l'Italie, avait une dette publique qui était en 72-73 était au 40%. 40%. Cette dette publique est arrivée en 20 ans à 125%. 94. Donc de 73 à 94, de 40% à 125%. Puis on a signé le traité de Maastricht, on est entré dans le processus de Maastricht, et l'Italie aujourd'hui a une dette de 130%. Donc, dans les 20 ans avant Maastricht, on est passé de 40 à 125. Après Maastricht, on est resté 125-130. Ça, c'est, je pense, une des clés pour dire ce que je voulais concrètement dire. Naturellement, Maastricht n'est pas populaire en Italie. Les efforts de bloquer la dette ne sont pas plus populaires en Italie, mais heureusement qu'on a eu Maastricht et tout ça. Sinon, on aurait une dette à 300%. Ça, je le dis d'une façon très, très simple. Et la même chose pour la démographie. On vient de parler de ça, et ce sont des phénomènes sur lesquels, ou bien vous avez un aperçu qui part de loin, et alors vous pouvez chercher de donner des politiques de long terme, ou bien ce n'est pas les pays, les nations qui peuvent faire des politiques de long terme si importantes que ça. Je pense que, sixième, l'intégration régionale est la seule façon pour créer une dimension d'influence au niveau global sur des politiques. J'ai cité dans la table ronde d'avant le climate change, mais naturellement je peux citer le commerce. Ou bien vous êtes ensemble, et alors dans les négociations vous êtes en condition d'influencer, ou bien chacun tout seul dans un monde globalisé et si grand que ça, la possibilité d'influencer est absolument réduite à la marge. Et l'intégration régionale est décisive. C'est très facile de le dire, c'est un proverbe de vie normale. C'est la situation dans laquelle 1 + 1 ne fait pas 2, mais fait 3, réellement. Et mon point final est le point de la culture de l'éducation. L'expérience européenne, là, c'est une expérience de succès sur 2 sujets. Le sujet des étudiants et le sujet des chercheurs et des professeurs. L'expérience positive de l'Erasmus et l'expérience positive des projets de recherche qu'on a au niveau européen sont, je pense, des histoires qui nous racontent que l'Europe, aujourd'hui, est un lieu, un espace d'études, de recherche, de culture, qui est un des grands succès de l'Europe. Et ceux qui témoignent tout ça, ce n'est pas mes paroles ici, maintenant, mais c'est le fait que, et j'imagine que pour les SEC, c'est le même de ce qui est en train de se passer chez nous à Sciences Po, on voit, je ne veux pas me moquer d'eux, absolument, je les respecte beaucoup, mais on voit une montée d'attention vers nous de la part des universités britanniques. Parce qu'elles sont toutes aujourd'hui dans les réseaux des financements de recherche européens, et ils savent très bien qu'ils vont sortir de tout ça. Et ils savent très bien que la seule façon d'y rester, c'est de rester liés avec des projets bilatéraux ou multilatéraux avec nous. Et tout ça parce qu'aujourd'hui, les grands projets de recherche en Europe sont basés sur les financements et la façon de faire la recherche au niveau européen. C'est une histoire de succès. Et l'intégration régionale, là, aide beaucoup. Voilà mes 7 très synthétiques, mais j'ai déjà trop parlé, donc mes très synthétiques propositions pour faire un plaidoyer en faveur de l'intégration régionale dans le monde d'aujourd'hui. Ce sont des recettes qui sont liées à des choses qu'on a vues, qu'on est en train de tester dans la vie concrète, mais je pense que ce sont les recettes importantes pour aussi le futur. Merci.
Thank you. Can I invite Ms. Noyer to speak now?
Thank you very much. I feel a little bit embarrassed to move to English after the marvelous French of Dr. Letta was so beautiful that I maybe couldn't match really. But okay, maybe I move to French at some point in my presentation. I would like to start with the European experience in the 20th century, just to recall why we came to regional integration. And the origin really is the first point of Mr. Letta. It is very political. There was a willingness in 1946, 47, to make war impossible again in Europe. It was a famous speech by Churchill in Switzerland in 1946, who was proposing United States of Europe, not for the UK, by the way, but for the rest of Europe. And most importantly, they were in the following years, 46, 47, very important meetings between the leaders of Italy, Germany, France, Jean Monnet, De Gasperi, Adenauer, who prepared that. Then, I skip a number of episodes, but it was decided to move to economic integration as a way to create strong links and make war impossible. To make a long story short, a German concept which was a common market, and a more French concept which was common policies. And the common market, which was the first step, is the result of that. So there were several steps. Common market in 1958, or after the Treaty of Rome, which was prepared by a conference in Messina, Italy. It's basically made of free trade agreement, customs union, common policies like agriculture, and the four freedoms. The famous four freedoms we find now with a lot of debates, but goods, services, capital, and people, meaning students, meaning workers, meaning etc. Then, second step, big step, the early 90s, we moved to the single market. What do we add then? The same regulations, technical norms, etc. Competition rules, the enactment of rules being ensured by the European Court of Justice, a single judge, a jurisdiction, and that means that you can freely not only move but provide, send goods, provide services. The regulations are the same, so there is no need to check technically at the entrance of parts for construction of goods. And then, third step, we moved to EMU. Why the EMU? Because we had different currencies in a single market. It means distortions. We tried to reduce distortions by an European monetary system. But there were tensions in the system. We had to fight the tensions. It was painful for growth and financial stability. And then we came to the conclusion we need to have a common currency. Then with the common currency, but this worked very well for a decade. Then came the crisis. And the crisis was made, I will come back to the crisis in a minute, but then we decided that one of the things to fix was the difference, the links between the banks and the sovereigns. Then we decided to make a banking union and make a unified payment system. So that's basically why we progressively built what we have built, with a lot of benefits. To take, for instance, the euro, where we have very often arguments again saying we are not the perfect currency zone, is the optimal zone in the definition of Mundell, which is true, but it's also true of most, if not all, the big areas. Certainly the United States is not an optimal currency area. And the idea that you can easily have the workers in the automotive industry in Detroit moving to being specialists of high-tech software in California. It's just a mere something that does not exist. And on the other hand, we got from the euro two very important things: financial and price stability. Now, I will skip what I wanted to say on the euro debt crisis because I don't have the time. I'm too long. I will say a word on the consequences of Brexit for the European integration. Brexit is, at first sight, of course, a bad news for the European project. It's the first time a member is leaving, when since the 1950s, the European project has always been the progressive building up towards more integration and more members. And by the way, it reminds us that to build regional integration, like everything, you need a strong democratic support. At the same time, it might be an opportunity. First, an opportunity to increase the coherence of the European integration project. Britain has never been so much convinced by the political objective of the European project. It refused the EMU, it refused the banking union, it refused what we call the Schengen Agreement, that is the free circulation of persons, but total free circulation without border controls in the Schengen area. So we might have more cohesion and more unity between the various bricks of the building up of Europe in the future. And it's also an opportunity to take back control of its financial sovereignty for the Eurozone. I take two examples. One is simply the fact that we live today very bizarrely with a major financial center which is an offshore center outside the Eurozone, outside the control of the central bank, the Euro system, outside the control of the regulators of the Eurozone, outside the control of its governments. And one clear example, which has been mentioned by the governments in France, in Italy, and lately in Germany, is the euro clearing, where we had in 2011 two episodes of very strong tensions that were exacerbated by decisions taken by both the clearing house in London and the regulator at the FSA at the time in London, which were, of course, aiming at protecting the City of London, but also increasing dramatically the risks for the Eurozone to be confronted with even higher tensions than it was at the time. Some in the markets would say explosion of the Eurozone. And it was clear that this kind of arbitrage was made only possible because because of the importance of the clearing done outside the Eurozone. So reintegrating that kind of instruments which are so essential for financial stability, so essential for the exercise of sovereignty, is probably an opportunity that will be seized. I'll stop at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I turn to Professor Quah now, please?
Thank you, Manu. When we talk about regional integration, it is good to have in mind, to be clear, what we have in mind as the opposite. What is the alternative to regional integration? Is it global integration? Is it a collection of nation states just operating in autarky, only trading, or as one of the audience members suggested, with no concern for what the global order looks like? When Manu asked the question and then went into a description of what different kinds of regional integration look like in Asia, that was very helpful to us. It gave us a picture of what Asian or ASEAN regional integration might look like. My two co-panelists have provided us a wonderful, stirring, inspiring even vision of European integration. It is one that has an excellent narrative. It begins after the Second World War, when Europe's greatest politicians realized that we must never have war again. Such conflict must be made not just impossible, but materially unthinkable. And from that wonderful germ of an idea that grew all these wonderful institutions, the European coal and steel community, subsequent ever greater integration, and all of the artifacts of the European project, something that I think the rest of us around the world stand back and admire. It is a wonderful vision. I did live in Britain, and therefore as part of the European Union for a long time. But as the panelists have also described, Britain, even before Brexit, had always been schizophrenic or skeptical about the European project. Sometimes for no good reason at all, but sometimes, it was rejected from the first round of membership in the community, and then it self-consciously decided to stay out of the Eurozone, the single currency. It self-consciously made the decision not be part of the Schengen Agreement. Before I lived in Europe and tried to understand the schizophrenia that Britain countenanced in its dealings with Europe, I lived in America for decades, which also has a different idea about regional integration and multilateral or global integration. So with that background, I cannot tell the kind of story about regional integration as someone who's a fervently believer of the European project. What I can try and do is to say a little bit about the opposite, global integration and its failures. And from there, if it has failed, what do we do about that in Asia or in ASEAN? What do we make of regional integration now against this background of how it has evolved around the world? As everybody else at the Lee Kuan Yew School, I have 3 points to make. My first point is that global order is under considerable stress now. But it's a stress that is explicable. It is a stress that I think about in terms of demand and supply. I want to argue that the current conjuncture that we're at, world order is especially fraught with danger because of a mismatch between demand and supply, between culture, between understanding, between regional powers. I then want to say something very quickly about some of the more granular features that have led to this. Some of us, DPM Tarman and others, have pointed to the critical features of this discombobulation that we feel when we look at world order. And a lot of that has to do with, as my colleague Kishore Mahbubani said earlier, how politicians have not told the truth, or as clearly as possible, about globalization. So there's a lot of narrative out there now that says that we can understand the stresses in the world because of globalization and inequality. And that's a huge part of it. But I want to suggest in this final session that there's yet something else. And that something else is what seems to be an irrationality, a post-factualism that has emerged in politics. And this post-factualism is something that's extremely worrying. It's the kind of thing that historically has led to the rise of fascism and other extremist movements around the world. So this situation that we're in, this situation of mismatch between demand and supply, the fraught world order that we're in, is especially dangerous because we're in this dangerous position. And then I'm going to just take 15 seconds or so to conclude about how we in Asia can proceed on this. Now, on the first point, when I say there's a mismatch between demand and supply in world order, It would be great if for integration, for trade, all that we had to do was to sit down and I bring my cotton bales to the harbor, you bring your aircraft carriers or your jet aircraft to the other end of the harbor, and we trade. That's what trade and integration would be. But that's not how trade happens. Trade happens because of agreements, because of contracts, because of an understanding, standards, and norms. And to get all that in place, we need leadership. We need regional order or world order. The need for regional integration or the need for world order, even for those who want to live in a small state, not worry about world order, is that nothing happens economically unless you do have that world order. What's happened in world order now is that the traditional architects and providers of world order, the supply side, are now withdrawing from this global stage. Okay. These traditional providers did not just provide these contracts, rules of engagement, and so on. They also projected values of liberalism, multilateralism, respect for rule of law, a rugged individualism, a belief that you could, as an entrepreneur, go out and do wonderful things. But that is in retreat. What remains strong is the demand for world order. But the demand for world order has shifted. The rise of Asia as an economic powerhouse, the rise of Asia in the demand for goods and services, for trade agreements, it is here that that hunger now manifests. And the set of core values that are important here are different from those in the traditional transatlantic ones. Here is based, there's more of a networks-based idea rather than multilateralism. There's much more respect for hierarchy and stability rather than liberalism and rule of law. And there's a great emphasis on social responsibility rather than rugged individualism. There's a mismatch between supply and demand for world order. And this is a huge problem in the world. We no longer have the leaders that are able to provide the contracts, the rules of engagement. Part of the pullback, many have hypothesized, has to do with how globalization and inequality has moved in different ways. And in the world where all of us now have a copy of Thomas Piketty's book on inequality on our bedside, all 600 pages of it, we want to believe that it is inequality that's the cause of all this. But actually, you know what? The American victory of Trump did not come from his success appealing to those who had only been excluded from globalization. Trump won 54% of the votes of male university graduates. He won 53% of women voters. Young white Americans who had never experienced anything but globalization, they voted more for Trump than for Clinton. And of poor Americans, Americans who had incomes less than $50,000 a year, the majority voted for Clinton. It is the rich people who voted for Trump. So the standard story about inequality causing the rise of this populism needs to be re-examined. At the same time that all this is going on, we're all worried about technology. Connectivity makes us all understand each other better, but robotics and autonomous technologies make us insecure. We live in a dangerous, scary world, where world order is being withdrawn just as it is ever more needed. Where do we go from here? And this is my last 30 seconds. What does Asia do for this? Asian regional integration will face considerable challenges. Economically and politically, we are diverse, as people have said. We have the same tensions of identity, distrust, and envy. We have failures of political will and leadership everywhere around us. But you know what? For Asia, regional integration among Asians might be the only game left in town. And if we don't pull together and continue to, yes, work with those who want to work with us, but we have to give up the idea that there's a world order that we plug in and that we can feel safe and secure in. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We've had three very, very insightful interjections. Maybe I'll just kick off with a couple of questions, and maybe I could ask you, Enrico, the first question. You mentioned the need for democratic legitimization for the integration project, otherwise it wouldn't work very well. But it strikes me that in Europe, there seems to be some loss of legitimization. For instance, in the European Parliament, which I guess is the Europe-wide mechanism for legitimation, the voter turnouts are much lower, and quite often it's a protest vote that leads to the election outcomes rather than a vote on actual specific European matters. So do you have in Europe the mechanisms that can actually deliver that political legitimacy for your project?
You mentioned, I think, one of the core issues today in Europe and for the future of Europe, because we have to deal with this problem and I think with the lack and with the unbalanced situation on this topic. I think we had the top of the problem, we experienced the top of the problem during the Greek crisis. There were many reasons to ask to the Greek to accept the conditions that the European Union, the creditors, and so on, asked them to accept. Many reasons. Because of their past mistakes, because of the budgets not in order, because of the fact that the wage of the public people, bureaucrats in Greece raised in the last 10 years, in the 10 years after the euro accession for 100% or something like that. So many reasons. But they had, and this is why we had Varoufakis for a period, they were strong in one topic. They were strong towards the European public opinion. The topic was they voted, they had their own parliament completely legitimized by the Greek public opinion and by the Greek voters, so the popular sovereignty. And on the other hand, on the other part of the negotiations, they were them legitimized, and then on the other side, not a political European partner, but they had the Troika. The Troika was absolutely necessary, useful and very well working. But in the relationship with the public opinion, having on the one hand, the parliament voted, already voted, so full of sovereign legitimacy. On the other hand, a Troika composed by only bureaucrats, IMF, not only Europeans, but IMF, first of all, ECB and the Commission, that created an unbalanced situation on legitimacy. So the concrete reasons were absolutely there for many. I can't, but so this is why I think there's a problem today. One problem is we can take advantage from the Brexit, because the problem that Christian knows very well is the sort of West Lothian question of the European Parliament, the fact that you can't, Mario Draghi can't go to the European Parliament because there you have the British Member of Parliament, the Swedish Member of Parliament, they are with another currency, so the president of the ECB is in an imbalanced situation there. And so we have the big lack of European Parliament legitimacy of the euro, because the legitimacy is only in the hands of the Eurogroup. The Eurogroup means the governments, not the parliament. So there's a problem there. So this is why I think we have to consider, and I fear in Germany there's a lack of awareness of the need to adjust the euro, to have the screwdriver on many, because I just mentioned this point, there are many other points, the ESM, we need an ESM, an European Stability Mechanism, more close to a sort of European Monetary Fund rather than the EMF, the ESM today, because we can't consider that the money of the ESM can be used only when the house is entirely destroyed by the fire. Because at that point, you need more money. And so it's better to use money 10 times less when you start to fear that the fire can arrive. But these points are just to say that the political legitimacy is a topic. The European Parliament point is important. Now the British will be out. I think the European Parliament can be considered in the future as the parliament of the euro, more than we had in the past, because we need a parliamentary assembly for the euro. I think it's necessary to avoid what we had for the Greek crisis.
Thank you. Monsieur Noyer, if I can follow up on his point about the Eurozone. And I think you rightly pointed out that this argument that the Eurozone is not an optimal currency area is not entirely fair, that the argument about labor mobility could hold elsewhere as well. But there are also other elements that the critics of the Euro program allude to. One is the lack of fiscal transfers, and the other is the lack of a common approach to banking crisis where people actually do share the risk completely. And the argument is that without addressing these issues, you just get more and more crisis from time to time.
Well, of course, there's something true in that. By the way, I want to say that I cannot agree more with your points, Enrico. And when I was vice president of the ECB, I was always shocked that going to the Monetary Committee of the European Parliament, I received much more questions from the nice questions, okay, sometimes difficult, but from the British, Swedish, and others. I mean, I was not there for that, really. I would have liked to answer tough questions from the Italian, German, and other French members. That's how we should work, and how we should understand the accountability of the central bank, and therefore its political legitimacy. But coming back to your question about fiscal transfers, I mean, first, we should not exaggerate fiscal transfers in the US, for instance. They are not so important. The benefits which are pooled at the federal level are not that important. Of course, there are things that go automatically through the federal budget, like military expenditure or things like that. But I mean, the difference is not what people imagine very often. And there are some fiscal transfers. There also we have some difficulty coming from the difference between the European Union and the Eurozone. Because you cannot grow a budget. If you grow the EU budget, it's the budget of the European Union. The Eurozone is only part of it. So we have the regional development funds and a number of things like this, social development fund, but it cannot grow in view of the single currency because there is a difference then. So there we come back to how to close the gap between the two circles. But I think it's true that we would need to grow that. But when you reflect on what are the conditions, you very quickly come to the need to have more I would say common policies or converging policies. Let's take an example. For an economist, obviously, what we should start first to pool is unemployment benefits, because then you can have, I mean, the cycles can be slightly different from one country to the other. And then if you have more unemployment in one country, less in another one, then you have automatic redistribution, and it's a fantastic tool. But of course, those who will fear to pay will say, okay, we're ready to pool, but provided the labor market rules are the same. So then you need to have convergence of labor market rules. Otherwise, some of us will create unemployment by badly adjusted labor market rules, lack of reforms. So let's have the same reforms first. And then some others will say, oh yeah, but labor market is one thing, but maybe we need to go a bit further than that. Maybe goods and services markets should be also more convergent in terms of rules. And then you see that it's more or less the whole economic policy that should continue to converge more. So that will probably be the big debate during the next few years. On your other question, which was the crisis. Further shocks. No, I think that really we have fixed a lot of things. Maybe it's underestimated, but we have reinforced, even if it's not working perfectly, we have really reinforced, the governments have reinforced the fiscal rules and the way there is surveillance. More, very importantly, we have created a monitoring that did not exist, and there was something lacking at the beginning of the euro. The monitoring of competitiveness, the crisis, the second episode of the crisis in Europe, the so-called sovereign debt crisis, is by to a large extent the result of divergence of competitiveness. And when you are in the monetary union, you have to understand that your unit labor cost should increase like the addition of the objective of inflation of the central bank plus the gains of competitiveness that you are making. I mean, if you go beyond that, and that was the major problem of Greece. If you go completely out of that, then you lose competitiveness, you cannot devalue, and you are confronted with the necessity to make real adjustment. Otherwise, and that was the problem of Greece, if they had not adjusted, simply transferring was not enough, unless you promised to transfer until the end of the world. But there is no way that you can come back to a normal situation if you do not make real adjustment, which is very painful. We have, even if it's not perfect, I agree with Dr. Letta, we should have a real European Monetary Fund to be able to act more preemptively, but still we have now a big tool that did not exist. We have made the banking union. It's not yet completely finished, but it's under progress, and it's done to a large extent, etc., etc. So we are in a much stronger shape than we were in the past, and I think we would be able to cope with new issue problems if they arise.
Thank you. Maybe, Danny, I think you quite rightly said that regional integration is really the only game for the Asian, especially ASEAN nations, right? But there are some fundamental problems now we face in ASEAN. ASEAN created the ASEAN Economic Community, which has been welcomed with a loud yawn by most companies, people on the ground. And the hard fact is that if you look at the interests, they are diverging. Maritime ASEAN is diverging from continental ASEAN, which feels the full gravitational pull of China's political and economic influence. And the fundamental interests within ASEAN are changing. Having said that, then how are we ever possibly going to gain the kind of scale we want in order to compete with China and India and so on?
Yeah, absolutely, Manu. I couldn't agree more. Moreover, I think one of the things that's becoming really clear in the panel discussion here, the set of economic and political challenges that the European project currently faces, working through the European sovereign debt crisis, issues of democratic legitimacy, the democratic deficit that is perceived by some, the drive towards ever greater integration, those are so remote at this point from the kind of problems we're having to deal with in Asian regional integration. And we're much more back at a very, very basic preliminary level. We're still, Asia, ASEAN today, for all the wonderful things that the ASEAN economic community have brought about in terms of zero tariffs, ASEAN today trades only 25% of its total trade with one another within the community. Europe trades 65 to 70%. And the challenges in Europe are 100% diametrically different from that we have in Asia. But where I find some cause for optimism is that trade and security agreements eventually have to go together. Okay. It is not possible to think about trade as being one set of issues that we will work through with, say, China, and then we'll work through our security problems with the United States or with Western Europe. Eventually, these have to be aligned. Certainly, America views it that way, and Asia will eventually have to get to do that too. So, and I suppose it is, if we go back to ASEAN's roots, ASEAN came together in the late 1960s because of a fear of an external common enemy. That common enemy or that identity has metamorphosed over the decades since, but it remains out there as an other. Like you say, how will we compete with China or with India? And perhaps it is some appreciation of this diverging and drifting traditional trade and unconventional modern security concerns that will drive Asia and ASEAN together again, just as it did in the 1960s. Our initial starting points and our trajectories, ASEAN and EU, for all the commonalities that Kishore and Dr. Letta, you would like to emphasize, for all the commonalities, we are still so far away from each other in our state of political build. We have so much to learn from Europe, and I hope there's a little bit of vice versa too.
Thank you. We have about 15 minutes left. May I open up to the floor and invite the first comment or question, please? Yes, at the back, over there. Thank you.
Thank you. Jérôme Deton with the French Embassy in Singapore. I have a question for our European panelists first. Don't you think that the only game in town left, to quote Professor Quah, for Europe is to come to terms with the fact that to reignite momentum in the European project, you need to accept multi-speed or two-speed Europe, I don't know, because it's very hard to see today how we're going to be able to experiment deeper integration, but within the euro area, irrespective of its current difficulties. Very hard to see how European Union at 27 can really, be able to deliver sort of a deeper integration you have been talking about. My second question is for Professor Quah. You mentioned earlier that there is distrust within Asia. It's very striking that, for instance, when China tried to sell the AIIB project, the obsession in early 2014 was to dilute themselves, right? To make sure that they would be credible to create a cooperative institution where they could work in trust with other Asian players. What are the 2 or 3 ingredients you think that China should consider in terms of improving, the confidence of its Asian partners, possibly, in order to work together at addressing, whatever challenges the Asians think they should address together right now? Thank you.
Perhaps we can start with Mr. Noyer.
Thank you. Of course, with the Brexit, when the UK leaves, normally all the others, with the special case of Denmark, but which is so much linked to the Eurozone that it's not a real difference, are committed to enter the Euro one day. So we are left with countries being in the Euro and countries being committed to come when they are ready to come. In theory, at least, it's like that. But this being said, when I myself believe, but I say that with humility in front of Dr. Letta, who might completely disagree with me, but it seems to me that we would benefit enormously if we could have a set of a subset of the institutions devoted to the Eurozone. That is, that if we had really a subset of the European Parliament with only the members of Parliament representing the Eurozone countries, the Eurozone, if we had a subset of the European Commission devoted to the Euro area problems, I wonder whether we could not have and a real institutionalization of the Eurogroup. So to have a coherent council of Eurozone governments. Then we would have all the political institutions able to be the counterpart at a higher level, maybe, of the central bank. And we would have something more maybe a better engine to continue the integration in the various areas, the Eurozone, meaning the banking union, etc. Maybe it would work better, I don't know. But I feel that still, even if the difference would be less important, continuing to have the two circles with the same set of institutions is a bit difficult to understand, not very efficient, and remains a problem to have a good complement between the political institutions and the central bank.
The question is absolutely very well and linked to the reality today. I strongly believe that we have to fix the euro and we have to avoid any new crisis at the euro level, because we paid a price for the euro crisis. That was the true reason of the beginning of the crisis, of the political crisis too, in some European countries. Because when you have, at the end of the day, countries like Spain, like Italy, like Portugal, with youth unemployment moving from 20 to 50 or to 40% for 3, 4, 5 years in a row, and even France at 25 or 24%, and this situation continues for years and years, you will have immediate political and social consequences. And the consequence for my country is a consequence of lost generations. And these generations, they leave the country, first of all. Then they will, of course, vote for populist parties because they don't trust any traditional leader or response. So it's, I think the key problem is to fix the euro and to avoid any other new crisis at the euro level. So I completely share what Christian said. The second main point, so on this topic, I see reaction solutions at the euro area level. And we have to do it at the euro area level. But there are other issues where it is necessary to have at 27 the solution. And of course, I mentioned in the previous panel the migrations. But these topics too, these two topics, I think, are the two topics where the influence and the way to change the political and social landscape oblige the leaders to deal with this topic with, I would say, unconventional tools and very, very powerful solutions. So for migrations too is the other key point, and we need to move. I fear about migrations because I see, unfortunately, many, and I would say too many similarities with the euro crisis. The same, a crisis, of course, two different fields, completely different. The euro on the one side, the interest rates and the public debt on the one side, migrants, so people on the other side. So completely different. But if you look at the fact that, first, the European Union, when the two crises raised, the European Union was unprepared on the first one and on the second one. For the first one, when Ireland asked a program, asked protection, we were obliged to ask the IMF to come in and to solve the problem because we were without any tool at the European level to solve a problem of a country of the euro area being in crisis. For the migrant crisis, it's exactly the same. We were without any tool because this topic was the third pillar of Maastricht, so it was an intergovernmental topic until the Lisbon Treaty. Then we started to adjust the institutional response system, but at the European level, we took, Christian, how many years? 4 years before arriving to the treaty changes to the new treaties in 2012, the ESM and all the rest. But the big damage was exactly the period between 8 and 12. And we paid the bill, and we are still paying the bill of having waited for 4 years. We are doing the same mistake for the migrants, because we are waiting time before creating the tools. And the same mistake for the euro at the very beginning. The response of the leaders was very vocal response. Many meetings, European Council meeting each 2 weeks with new announcement, 100 billion investment, a plan of that, a plan of... Then on the 5th meeting, we understood that no one of the first meeting tool was in delivery, so we started to say there's something wrong. We are the same with the migrants. Many decisions, announcement. Now we announced the creation of the board control guard coast. That's good, but we have to do it. We have not just to announce, decide, and stop. So I see many similarities. This is why I think on this topic, yes, there are many reaction and many resistance from the public opinion, but addressing these topics in a different framework at 19 and at 27 is decisive for the future of the European Union relationship with the people.
Thank you. Danny?
Thank you. Before I begin my answer to your question about AIIB, I wonder if I might pick up on the other co-panelists and what you've said about Europe, because I think this is an absolutely important lesson for Asia as well. Policymakers need to get ahead of the curve. They can't be trying to fix up problems after the explosion has occurred. We've seen this happen for the Eurozone sovereign debt crisis. We're seeing this unfold in the powerful narrative that you've described for the migrant crisis, for the refugee crisis. What is it that we face in Asia that we need to get ahead of the curve on? Well, you see, here's my candidate. So if I were a policymaker trying to look 20, 15, 20 years ahead, I'd be thinking, what have the advanced countries dealing with globalization have had to deal with that will be coming for us in Asia as we continue regional integration? Is it going to be the rise of this post-factual politics because of globalization and inequality? Whatever it is, we need to get ahead of the curve. And we've had very little discussion in this region about the kind of welfare or social protection schemes, dislocation, relocation that Europe and America are already dealing with. And Asia needs to get ahead of the curve on this. On the AIIB question, excellent point. So the question is, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, led by China in the first instance, how can China and the AIIB bring about, cultivate greater trust in Asia for what's going on there? Okay. And if we think through the history of the AIIB, it's quite interesting. Actually, today, all the major countries, with 2 significant exceptions, are not members of the AIIB. So in other words, all the major countries in the world have seats at the board, are able to participate in common decision-making. What are the 2 exceptions? The United States and Japan. Canada signed up a few months ago, and pretty much everyone else is on board already. So in terms of the question, the mistrust, Singapore, which is an astute geopolitical player, its MFA hardly ever makes a wrong step, Ambassador. You're all on top of the game. Singapore was one of the first signatories on the MOU with AIIB. It was one of the original members at the founding of the AIIB. It placed its bet early on. This was going to be something that was good for all of Asia. And indeed, that's how the story has unfolded. AIIB is not a threat in the usual sense to the international financial architecture. Its balance sheet is only about $100 billion US. ADB itself is 160, World Bank is 240, IMF is over $1 trillion. It is tiny relative to these other institutions in the international financial architecture. It is tiny even for what it wants to do. What Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank wants to do is to plug the infrastructure investment gap in Asia. Estimates of that suggest that that gap is about on the order of $700 billion a year. AIIB's total balance sheet is only 1/7 of that. So it's a relatively small player in how this thing unfolds. It is exactly an attempt to build multilateral cooperation, trust, along the lines that you say. Now, the thrust for your question may be brought out by why then is China engaging in the kinds of territorial aggressive actions in the South China Sea? So here, what we run into is that China itself is managing the need for greater multilateral collaboration, the need to be a good citizen in the world, with a certain kind of rise of nationalistic sentiment and a lack of clarity on its own sovereign claims. Unless it's able to resolve that, other countries in Asia will not yet be able to be fully trusting of it. But I think on the economic side, on the AIIB side in particular, it's already got a good story. Thank you.
Thank you. I was told to end this discussion at 4:28 exactly. We have 2.5 minutes. So I think the best thing I can do is to pose a final question to each of the panelists, and just maybe a couple of sentences. I think at the previous session, we sort of agreed that Europe and Asia should come together, and maybe Europe and ASEAN in particular. So my question is there a political scope for a full-blooded economic partnership agreement between Europe and ASEAN, not on the lines of some of the old free trade agreements which only focus on tariffs, but a real bold move like the TPP could have been? Is there sufficient political will and interest in an ASEAN-EU meeting agreement of that nature? Maybe Enrico.
I have to diversify my answer and the answer of the European citizens, because my answer is yes, we need it. Frankly speaking, I don't know today if the European citizens are ready to reopen pro-free trade mode. We saw what happened in France, Germany, Italy, on TTIP, on Canada. We didn't mention, and it's better to close the topic, but Belgium, Wallonia, Canada, and the unbelievable situation we experienced on this topic. So it is clear that on this topic we need, in my view, we need a period to explain, to make people aware that free trade is not the devil. There are possibilities to protect and at the same time to open up and to have opportunities. But I'm sure that on some of the issues, like the one with Vietnam, it was a success. I hope with Indonesia we'll be on the same path. But I think we need, and in the future, the need to have a comprehensive agreement. ASEAN, European Union is absolutely necessary. ASEAN is doing, for what I know, the last year decisions, the roadmap within ASEAN is a fantastic good news in a world in which on this news we have exactly the opposite.
Thank you. Noyer?
Well, very much along the same lines. I do think personally that there are a lot of things that Europe and ASEAN should do together. I think that we need to be to spend more time in trying to build cooperation and complementarities with Asia in general, but in particular ASEAN. We have gone a long way in negotiating with Japan a free trade agreement, whether, well, depending on the environment, but whether we can continue and show the Americans that the rest of the world is not acting like some of them may think, might be interesting, but there is the political difficulty that Enrico just mentioned, and so probably we need to wait a little bit to see how the elections move next year in different countries in Europe to have a better sense of where we can go. But it would be good if we could restart. There are also maybe other elements of cooperation or the domains of cooperation we should explore. Thinking of, for instance, financial regulations. We are a bit wondering what the new administration in the United States will do. They were pushing for extremely tough regulations because of the disaster of the subprime crisis that infected the entire global world. Even if we had our part of responsibilities later, but I think in the Europeans, many of the Europeans and many of the Asian countries had the same kind of more balanced way of thought. We need, of course, to make this financial world more sure and stronger and safer. On the other hand, we should not kill the financing of the economy. And that kind of balanced vision maybe should lead to more active cooperation, not to be told too much unilaterally what our agenda should be by just one big country in the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Danny.
Thank you, Manu. The quick answer to the question, will ASEAN and EU come together? My hopeful, optimistic answer is yes, of course. We're all good friends and we want to work together for a better world. My assessment of probabilities and sort of a realistic take on the scenario suggests that we will have to work very hard to make this happen. Asia is going to be extremely attracted to the idea of a kind of TPP minus the United States, combined with some version of RCEP. TPP minus and RCEP were always supposed to be able to work together. The promise is that there will be trade agreements without the lecturing on human rights, environmental protection, labor standards, and poorer countries are going to find that more attractive. It is an expensive proposition for them to meet these standards. So RCEP has promised that it will make special provision for the CLVs of the world, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnams of Asia, and that will be a great attraction. You combine that with the China proposition. If we remove the mistrust of AIIB, as in the earlier discussion, AIIB comes with the One Belt, One Road initiative. These numbers are all picked out of the air, but then, so was the TPP number. TPP promised to raise GDP by 1.1%. OBOR, One Belt, One Road, promises to raise GDP of all the connected countries by $2.5 trillion GDP. How much is that? That's one ASEAN. One Belt, One Road initiative promises to raise the incomes of the countries that it connects by one ASEAN GDP today. Now, whether that's going to materialize or not, the narrative that we need to take forward is everybody's going to be discussing this, but one side, the China side, is promising to fill up the vacuum with all kinds of goodies. We don't see the USPs, the unique selling propositions from the other side. So my realistic assessment is we'll have to work really hard.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end. Thank you very much.